Hello everybody, Verma here again. I'm back to discuss my final project for my 2021 MSGP Stormwater Pollution Prevention Plan training under the Pre-Management Development Program. Stormwater. It's a vital part of the water cycle and is key to the functionality of any ecosystem because it replenishes both surface and groundwater reservoirs. Without the replenishment of those surface and groundwater, all ecosystems in the world will perish. The drawback of stormwater is that it washes away everything that's on the land and brings it to the nearest river, lake, or aquifer. This is done through a separate storm system from the sanitary sewer system, which processes the wastewater through a treatment facility. Because storm drains are separate from the sewer, anything that's on the land will get washed into the drain and go directly into the river. Unfortunately, most of what is on the land is harmful to both humans and animals alike. Since stormwater is a natural phenomenon, many city employees are not aware of what is needed to protect stormwater. They're not familiar of how significant it is to daily lives, or even have an understanding of how stormwater is a federally regulated event. Earlier in the year, it was identified that was a flaw in enforcing the yearly Stormwater Pollution Prevention Plan training, or what's known as SWPPP, to the City of Albuquerque industrial-type facilities, which are regulated under the Environmental Protection Agency's 2021 Multi-Sector General Permit, or what is known as the MSGP. The purpose of this project is to expand on the department's existing SWPPP training over the next 2 to 3 years to include the parameters of the 2021 MSGP. This project will incorporate the over 40 industrial-type facilities throughout the city that are required to take this yearly training, and all of their employees on staff that report to those facilities. The project will also include the assistance of the Employee Learning Center and its online platform to help create an online basis for the training. It'll involve discussions, online training requirements for facility directors, division managers, supervisors, managers, and/or training specialists. This is in order to create buy-in and value for the training at a much higher level within the city. At the completion of this project, there will be various opportunities for the employees who work in these facilities to be trained. Managers and supervisors alike will have the options to tailor this training to suit the needs of each staff member in order to maintain compliance for the city. There are many impacts for not following federal regulations. One of these is being penalized through monetary fines, while other impacts can include being placed under numerous audits that can take up time and funding. Even though those fines can be up to $50,000 a day and can lead to a total of millions in fines, the bigger reason for training our city facilities is to protect our natural resources, our Rio Grande, from contamination and pollution that can put us in dire straits when it comes to our drinking water and other natural resources. Our team worked hard during this first year and consisted of my project sponsor, Shelley Eaton, engineer, myself, Verma Villegas, project manager, stormwater inspector, my steering committee, stormwater field supervisor, Byron Villegas, all our stakeholders, which included the facilities and the departments required to take the SWPPP training, and of course, my team members who, in addition to the project manager, which is myself, Byron Villegas, also included Mark McConnell, stormwater inspector. My project details and descriptions included utilizing the DMAIC process to create my project plan. I created a training presentation which we placed on the Employee Learning Center By putting that training presentation on an online platform, it allowed it to be available to all staff members that needed to take that training. We established training protocols for the facilities to implement, and we obtained feedback from those facilities. Once we obtained feedback from the facilities, we did discover that some staff were not included in the initial training data gathering. We also brainstormed with our team and created changes to accommodate the feedback that we got back. And in years 2 and 3, we will implement those changes to train all staff, including those staff that were not in the initial data gathering. In review, in my design phase, I explained the background behind the Stormwater Pollution Prevention Plan, or SWPPP training, and how it stemmed from the Environmental Protection Agency and ultimately moved down the chain through to the 2021 Multi-Sector General Permit, or what's known as the MSGP. Currently, under the MSGP permit, only the City of Albuquerque has jurisdictional authority to enforce it, so therefore we have to start our enforcement efforts here in our own backyard. The scope of my project is to include the training of all employees under the permit and to have those employees completely trained and on a yearly schedule within 3 years of the start of the project. Additionally, this project will have 3 goals, one for each year. In the first year, I'd like to have at least 60% of my targeted employees trained online. After the second year, 80%. And after the third year, have all 100% of my targeted employees completing their SWPPP training online. This project scope will not include the training of temporary employees. As mentioned earlier, my project was divided between 3 years, mainly because I had to work with numerous facilities and try to incorporate them into a plan that would work for everyone. In the first year, I started my pilot program. Since we have to have training each year, this was the best way to make sure that training was done and to test the waters to see where everyone stood in regards to training. I updated the SWPPP presentation, worked with ELC to get the training online, also discussed with the facilities what was required or needed to ensure online training was available to all employees. We discussed requirements with supervisors, training managers, division managers, and obtained all the training logs from the ELC and from each facility to determine a final count of fully trained SWPPP employees for this year. In the second year, I would make adjustments to the presentation, continue to contact new supervisors, training managers, and division managers. I will provide deadlines to each of these facilities so they may establish a training schedule within their own facility, discuss with IT about obtaining necessary equipment, and maintain a final count of trained employees for this second year to ensure that it has reached goal. The third year will include ensuring that all adjustments are made to the presentation and the processes. That way facilities will have all these in place and be able to follow them in order to achieve training each year. The solution for this project, once the online SWPPP training was complete, would be to require that all staff at each of the facilities covered under the MSG permit would be able to take this training on the Employee Learning Center online platform. The objectives of this project are to ensure that all staff at each of the MSGP permitted facilities are trained in SWPPP. However, due to the extensive number of various facilities and the number of staff at each facility, it was decided the project would extend past the 1 year to ensure its success. And for that reason, the following objectives were determined. By December 15th of year 1, 60% of all staff will be trained. By December 15th of year 2, 80% of all staff will be trained. By December 15th of year 3, 100% of all staff will be trained. In addition to that, since we discovered that transit and solid waste drivers were not included in the original gathering of data. I included in them a way to go ahead and be trained as well. So the drivers will be trained through the ELC originally when they are first coming on board, when they're first hired. And hopefully by the second year, I want to make sure that 50% of all those drivers will have a yearly pamphlet training by the end of that year. Under the measure phase, just for a quick review, I made sure that the SWP training was done. I reviewed it as it had been done in the past. The as-is map signified the various ways that SWP training was performed, both pre and post-COVID. Since COVID directly impacted our training practices, I included both aspects of the training. From the as-is map, I initially created a survey that asked how many employees from each series reported to work at each of the facilities, and out of those that reported to work, how many received the SWP training in the past. I charted the results of the survey to visually show how current processes only allowed for minimal SWP training of all facility staff. I concluded my measure phase with cost analysis, informing about fees that can be implemented from the EPA and the difference between costs to outsource SWP training as opposed to keeping the SWP training an internal process with the city. The difference was a significant $20,000, making the internal process an obvious choice to continue training. Phase was to develop a budget for the training. My research revealed numbers for the outsourced training in the past. Thereby, I utilized those numbers as a basis for creating the budget on my project. According to the past budget demands for SWP training, it had cost upwards of $30,000 to outsource the training required by the MSGP permit. By keeping the training in-house, it minimized the cost to less than $10,000 in employee hours for the DMD Storm Drainage Design Division, and that's just to produce the training. The additional cost of creating the SWP pamphlets for the transit and solid waste drivers took less than 5 hours for the inspector to produce, and cost approximately $120 more. There would not be any distribution costs for these pamphlets because the departments that need them will get them delivered electronically, and each of these facilities themselves will bear the cost to print and disperse to their employees. All the other time utilized by the Employee Learning Center is costs that will not reflect on the DMD budget. This is just an initial cost of creating the SWP online for this first year. Each year after that will cost the department less employee hours and will be based on any needed changes that might occur during inspections. As you can see, a rough estimate for years 2 and 3 will cost the department only a bit over $1,000 in man-hours, compared to the possible millions of dollars in potential fines if the department does not ensure SWP training for all sites. I believe that a few thousand in man-hours is well worth the effort. The issue, however, is to get the staff at each of these facilities to get the training done. Which leads me to my analyze phase. So as a review, under my analyze phase, it was implemented through a fishbone diagram and a 5 why method of solving a problem. The fishbone diagram brought some insight into the issue. However, it was the 5 whys that really brought forth the light and the meat of the problem. Several whys were identified, but only a couple were chosen, mainly because they overlapped across the board and for the impact they could produce. One of these whys is the training of all the drivers, mainly those at solid waste and transit. These drivers had never been trained in SWP, even though they are part of those facilities and report to those facilities on a daily basis. It was discovered that they were not included in the initial gathering of numbers for total staff that will require SWP training. Several reasons were provided for not including them in the numbers. One of them being it wasn't in their union contract to drivers are already working overtime and thereby did not have enough time to train. The second why was overall being understaffed at each of the facilities. The significant shortage at each of the facilities, plus the loss of staff from either being sick or quarantined, created a black hole where managers and supervisors were doing the work of laborers just so they can keep up with all the tasks required to be done at the sites. This did not leave much time for training, and if the training was to be done, then it would create a public service issue for the facilities and those departments involved. As a review of my improve phase, I needed to make sure that my 2021 SWP training project had opportunity to be improved. My stormwater team and I sat down to brainstorm on what we knew of to date. We asked these questions. How are the facilities responding to the training itself? How can we improve on the process of the training? I sat down with 2 of my team members and we utilized the 6-hat method of brainstorming. Much of what was brought out in the analyze phase was addressed, focusing mainly on staff members not having enough time to do the 2-hour training. As mentioned before, it was during my improve phase that it was discovered transit bus drivers and solid waste fleet drivers were not included in the initial training regimen numbers. Once discovered, I gathered numbers from the ELC. It showed 140 solid waste drivers and over 250 transit drivers. Now these are staff members who are still required to take some SWP training because they still report to the covered facilities at the beginning and end of each day, and they are exposed to hazardous materials on a daily basis through not only the facility but through the operations of their own vehicles. Remember, these nearly 400 extra employees are in addition to the original reported employees provided at the beginning of the project. I could not ignore such a significant change in the project parameters and thereby included a possible solution in my improve phase. From that 6-hat brainstorm session, I led the team to conclude that some form of modified training would have to be implemented in order to make sure that all employees at each of the facilities were trained. We focus on altering the original SWP training presentation to cater to those staff members that have to be out in the field for most of their working days, and we created pamphlets to provide to the transit and solid waste fleet drivers that can be accomplished within a very short time frame of less than 15 minutes. Additionally, the as-is map changed into the could-be map, showing how each of the modifications will be associated with each type of employee position. Speaking of maps, let's delve a little deeper into both the as-is and could-be map, since they both play an important part in the SWP training project. If you recall, the as-is map from the define phase of my project showed the SWP training process as it stood in the department at the start of the project. This map proved to be inconsistent with the permit and allowed for the majority of the staff at each of the facilities to miss out on SWP training, therefore placing the city in violation of the MSGP permit. This project has now led to the creation of the could-be map. In the could-be map, it shows how online training will be modified to cater to specific employees, such as drivers during their hiring, and online training, and of course, yearly pamphlet training. Additionally, it depicts how the manager and E-Series will continue with full training. Since they are key in maintaining compliance on their facility, they will need to have the full training on a yearly basis, while the B-Series will take or can take various versions of the training according to time and available staff schedules and job descriptions. This version of SWP training should flow easier for each department because they'll be able to modify the training according to their needs, and this will provide a clear pathway for the facilities to train all personnel on site, allowing for them to walk through the process and providing them options for obstacles which may hinder from having all staff trained. So as mentioned, the suggested solution that was agreed upon by all team members was to create various levels of training for each type of employees. Supervisors, managers, and E-Series employees, they will take the full 2-hour training. That includes explanations of the importance of minimizing contaminants into stormwater, all aspects of the permit regulations, all regulated best management practices, and a 15-question quiz. The E-level employees will then have the option to have all their labor or B-Series employees take an approximately 1-hour class that is either one, proctored by their supervisors, which will include the online training and involves explanation of the importance of minimizing contaminants into the stormwater, all regulated BMPs, and a 10-question quiz. Or the B-level employees can take a modified online training on an individual basis that will include all the necessary information just listed. Transit and solid waste, their drivers will read and sign a pamphlet each year to indicate that they have taken SWPPP training. The reason for this is because these drivers are only on site at the facilities for minimal time to pick up and drop off their vehicles. They will need to be aware of some aspects of the SWPPP because they work in areas where industrial materials or activities are exposed to stormwater. For example, the vehicles that they drive. But they will not need to know all aspects of SWPPP since their time on site is limited. In order to minimize the risk of jeopardizing vital city public services, these drivers are unable to obtain training in a proctored classroom setting or an online platform, so must have training through an alternative method. Training that is provided through this solution will minimize the need to pay for outsourcing of SWPPP training. Each year, it will cost the department less money to maintain this SWPPP training online. This solution will also allow for tracking of training in order to report to the EPA when needed. Additionally, it will utilize the Employee Learning Center to its fullest potential and minimize violations found during quarterly routine inspections, as well as minimize the chance of the EPA audit and minimize the chance of EPA finding a violation and charging resulting fines in regards to the training. As with every project, there are risks that need to be evaluated. Two of the main risks involved are changing facility operations. Some facilities, no matter how hard we try to change, they will not accommodate SWPPP requirements. This will be an issue, and initially, we will implement higher level management to ensure compliance. If that does not work, then the facility will continue to be out of compliance, and after the 45-day EPA required waiting period, the information will have to be reported to the EPA. Secondly, there still may be a chance that not all employees will be SWPPP trained. Some facilities will continue to argue against training certain personnel. We will continue to provide the various options for the training either online, through a proctored classroom setting, or through pamphlet. And again, if compliance is an issue, then it will be reported to the EPA after the 45-day required waiting period. To ensure the plan continues to be a success, several control options were developed. Mainly, all new employees will take the full training regardless of status during their onboarding process for each facility. This will provide a good background for each employee to work from. Then, each staff member from supervisors, managers, B-Series, and drivers, they will all have their yearly SWPPP training requirement through one of the newly defined options, sometime before December 15th of each year. Also, within the last year of the project, we'll work with the new employee orientation to provide a training pamphlet to each new city employee, regardless if they'll be working in a SWP qualified facility. So therefore, if any of the required employees miss onboarding training for whatever reason, at least they will have obtained some sort of training during NEO. One of the main control measures is to ensure documentation of all SWP trained personnel, so utilizing the ELC training reports and the MS4 email to track employee training will ensure a vital amount of staff will be trained in SWP. Here are my preliminary results for year 1, and I have to say they turned out to be a great success. Even though both transit and solid waste drivers were left out of the original numbers, I still believe we had a significant successful pilot program and that we should maintain it on the Employee Learning Center. Now, viewing the graph, the green indicates the total number of employees provided to me by each facility at the beginning of the project. The light pink shows the number of those staff members trained in 2020. The blue shows the number of employees trained through the pilot program this year in 2021. To look at the results in a different way, of all the numbers that were provided to me, I was given a total of 496 total staff that required SWP training. In 2020, only 60 of those staff were trained. During the pilot program in 2021, nearly 400 of the staff were trained. That is a 79% of all known staff being trained this year through my online SWP training platform. These results are significant because I was not planning to be at this number until the end of year 2, and I reached it at the end of year 1. I would like to say at this point, thank you to my stormwater team for a great year, and thank you all for hardworking staff at each of these facilities for working together to achieve this goal. At this time, I am ending my final project presentation. This is a requirement for the graduation in the City of Albuquerque Pre-Management Development Program. Again, I'd like to thank you for listening to all of my toll gates and staying with me through the end. Thank you, and remember, if we work together, we can keep our Rio Grande grand.